Ferdinand Marcos Jr. clinched a stunning landslide victory in the Philippines presidential election, bringing the son of a former dictator back to lead the nation.
Anyone who knows the history of the Marcoses in the Philippines will be flabbergasted at this turn of events.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. And yes, if you know a little bit about the Philippines, the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. a couple of weeks ago is in some ways very shocking. His parents, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, ruled the country with an iron fist back in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And during that time, they managed to steal a record-breaking $5 to $10 billion from the country's central bank. They were finally overthrown in a revolution in 1986, but the Marcoses have been plotting a comeback ever since. And now, thanks to Ferdinand Jr., also known as Bongbong, they are back at the top. But how did he do it? And will he be anything like his father?
Let us bring Filipinos back to one another in service of our country, facing the crisis and the challenges of the future together.
An unassailable landslide victory.
Landslide.
Landslide.
Landslide victory.
The Filipino people have spoken. Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. will be the 17th President of the Philippines.
Anyone who knows the history of the Marcoses in the Philippines will be flabbergasted at this turn of events.
He is the son of probably the most famous and maybe infamous dynasty in Philippine politics.
This is my son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
His father and namesake, Ferdinand Marcos, ruled the country as a dictator for 20 years between 1965 and 1986.
During this time, thousands of labor leaders, politicians, and students were arrested. News outlets shut down, and enemies of the president detained, tortured, and even murdered. The family has also been accused of siphoning billions of state dollars during their time in power.
They had stored, some say, up to $10 billion in various assets. Most of their assets, which were essentially those that had been stolen from the government, were taken out of the country.
Filipinos rose up in 1986, and Marcos and his family fled the country. Furious mobs overran the presidential palace, famously discovering First Lady Imelda Marcos' collection of thousands of shoes.
But somehow they've managed to sort of romanticize that era.
His people have effectively used social media to sort of erase the blemishes, if you will, on the Marcos name and to build his father up as one of the great leaders of the Philippines.
It managed to convince people that it was actually a golden era of stability and security.
This election is a test of the hold of truth on reality in the Philippines.
This country shows you the impact of disinformation.
I never in my life thought that I'd be living in another Marcos presidency.
BBM! We won 20 million plus votes for BBM!
Mabuhay ang Pilipinas!
Marcos Jr. will be president, and the daughter of the outgoing strongman, President Rodrigo Duterte, will be his deputy.
Talking to experts about this, they say it may have been those names that thrusted these folks to victory.
They are going to wield tremendous power. We could be witnessing the return of an era of corruption and the kind of crony politics that we saw under Ferdinand Marcos Sr. back in the 80s.
It is not important who the messenger is. The importance is going to be the message.
Well, the return of the Marcos dynasty is clearly a worry for many, and yet he did manage to win and win big. Bongbong received just over 31 million votes, which is nearly 59% of all the votes that were cast, and double the number of his nearest challenger, Leni Robredo, the current vice president who campaigned to improve human rights. And it was a bruising defeat for boxing great Manny Pacquiao, who was smashed into third place with just over 3.5 million votes. Not exactly the thriller in Manila he was hoping for.
My decision to run was driven by my utmost desire to serve the country and uplift the lives of poor Filipinos.
Well, Bongbong's victory was secured despite his father's dark legacy. Ferdinand Marcos was the country's 10th president and led the country for over 20 years from 1965 to 1986. For nearly half that time, he imposed martial law. According to Amnesty International, during that period, 70,000 people were imprisoned, 34,000 people were tortured, and 3,200 people were killed. Ferdinand and his wife Imelda were officially found to have stolen up to $10 billion from the country's central bank. A mere $5 billion has been recovered, if that, according to the country's Presidential Commission on Good Government. Bongbong claims his father was rich before he became leader, thanks partly, he says, to his family discovering an ancient hoard of shipwrecked gold many years ago. Well, make of that what you will. What we do know for sure is that his parents spent vast sums and courted the world's most famous and prominent people while in power. Sometimes their hospitality was actually turned down. In 1966, the Beatles had to flee Manila after Imelda Marcos found out they wouldn't play a private gig at her home. Her anger incited a mob which scoured the city, intent on detaining the Fab Four.
John, what exactly happened at Manila Airport?
We got kicked and pushed about by some monkeys, and were very frightened.
Well, how frightened were you, George?
Terrified.
Well, Bongbong claims he remained best friends with the band. Hard to believe, but then again, Bongbong is an expert at putting a positive spin on his family's tarnished reputation. He's said to have spent a great deal on a massive social media campaign aimed at rewriting history. And that is a great way to reach Filipinos who spend more time on social media than almost anyone else in the world. Over 4 hours every day on average. Only the Nigerians beat them. Now here's Bongbong on Facebook being warm and cuddly with his son.
When you were a teenager, which family member did you go to for advice? And looking back, was it any good?
For advice, my father.
Ah, yeah.
Ang lagi kong pinupuntahan yung father ko.
And I assume it was good advice.
It was always very good advice, but it's not necessarily easy to follow. Hindi yung basta't madali. Pag ina-advisean kayong you have to do it this way, this way, this way, it's not the easiest way, but it's the best.
And this is Bongbong's website, where he shows off pictures with him and his father, and another one with him and his mother, as if they were just ordinary people, a sort of golden era for the Philippines.
Even my father, I don't think would object if I say she's the supreme politician in the family. My father is the statesman. He's the political genius. He's the all that.
Okay, let's bring in our guests now, and two of them are in Manila. Martin Andanar is the spokesman for the current and outgoing president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte. And Veronica Pedrosa is a journalist whose family had to leave the Philippines in 1971 after people close to her family were threatened. And finally, we have Jim Laurie, who is an American journalist who covered the Philippines in the 70s and 80s, and he's witnessed the assassination of the opposition leader, Ninoy Aquino, and the storming of the presidential palace in 1986. Welcome to all of you. Martin Andanar, I'd like to start with you. This was a shock result for many people around the world who weren't keeping a close eye on politics in the Philippines. Was it a fair result?
It wasn't a shock here in the Philippines. The surveys were very consistent, Matthew, from day one all the way to the end of the campaign and marching on to the elections. And
by all accounts, would you say it was a fair election? We did hear reports of vote counting machines going wrong and so on.
Yeah, it was fairly an honest election. Even the opposition, even the camp of the Vice President Leni Robredo, even herself, she conceded and gave her word that the election was done in a honest way.
Okay.
The same with the other opponents of the President-elect Bongbong Marcos.
Veronica, if you accept that the election was fair, then we have to start looking at how on earth did Ferdinand Marcos Jr. rehabilitate the family name. Perhaps you could explain.
Well, I'd like to take issue with what Mr. Andanar said, in the sense that he said it was an honest election. I think that the result you cannot argue with. He did win by a huge margin, by a landslide, but a lot of it was built on disinformation. And this is something that I think has come out in the international press as well as here. Nevertheless, there is a very deep problem when it comes to conducting elections and democracy in the whole world when it comes to the issue of disinformation. I think this is what's happened in Manila, in the Philippines, I should say, is going to be ring a dreadful toll on the way that democracy is exercised around the world. I'd also, however, like to say that part of the reason why Marcos won also, I think, is because of the failure of previous presidents, in the sense of failing to deliver on the dreams that had been spoken of in EDSA in 1986 after the fall of the Marcos regime. Most people are very young in the Philippines. They don't remember what happened back in those days, and they want something different. We have a very high poverty rate.
We're going to
here.
get to that Marcos era, the original Marcos era, with you and with Jim in a second. But Martin, if you could answer that point about misinformation, do you accept that misinformation played a significant role in the election of Marcos and Duterte?
It's undeniable that misinformation is rampant around the world, not only in the Philippines, but in many elections, including in the United States. This is a challenge that all of us must face, and the spread of misinformation, the spread of fake news is only supported by the platforms that are available for everyone. And unless we come up with legislation how to run after people who peddle misinformation, this will only spread in the years to come. And this is a challenge that not only the Philippines, not only any camp is facing, but this is a challenge that the whole world is facing.
Veronica, do you think that people who opposed Marcos's election were not heard? I want to talk about people, for example, the victims of the original, Marcos regime, who tried to block this campaign by citing Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s past tax conviction. Were their voices quashed? And also the Catholic priests, the 1,400 Catholic priests who endorsed his opponent, Leni Robredo, they said, "We deplore the fake, manipulative claims that aim to revise the history of our country." What happened to their voices? Were they not amplified sufficiently, or people just weren't interested?
I think a little bit of both, actually. I think that people want to look to the future here. As I said, it's a very young nation. That is not to say that the human rights violations that happened during martial law and indeed during the previous administration of Rodrigo Duterte didn't happen. They happened. There is truth. We have had so many tens of thousands of cases of human rights victims proven. We have heard about the robbery of billions of dollars from the accounts of the government in an unprecedented way by the Marcos regime, the father of this president. I think we have to look, at a really profound problem in Philippine society and the way that politics is run.
Jim, your reaction to the election of Marcos Jr.?
Yes, might I add that also, in addition to disinformation, there were also threats against journalists who wanted to tell the story of the 1980s or anything about the Marcos regime. I'm struck. I have a social media account. I have YouTube, and a lot of the videos of the 1980s are there. During the election campaign, and even as recently as this morning, the traffic on the YouTube page has gone up with a lot of very negative comments from the Philippines. Nearly everybody that goes to my YouTube account is from the Philippines. And the biggest mistake of our history, said one person when they talked about the EDSA revolution of 1986 and the Aquino regime that began that year and the end of Marcos. So tremendous amount of it seems to me, antagonism towards the truth out there, in addition to the disinformation campaign that my colleagues have talked about.
Jim, do you think that was officially orchestrated or funded by the campaign, or do you think that's an organic reaction?
I can't say for sure. I don't know. Those in the Philippines might be able to address that issue. But I do know that some international journalists have been threatened, and the threats had seemed to come from the Marcos campaign.
Martin Andanar, your boss's daughter, ran. She was extremely successful, perhaps even more so than Bongbong himself, for the vice president office. Was Rodrigo Duterte, the president, behind Sara, his daughter, in running? Did he throw his weight behind her?
The president did support Mayor Sara Duterte just by announcing it in one of our talk to the people addresses here in the Philippines, but he never went out there to campaign for the vice president-elect. He never even talked to us in the cabinet and in our weekly cabinet meetings or mini cabinet meetings. He never, he even told us not to engage in the national or the presidential or the vice presidential election. So, in other words, all of us in the cabinet were not involved in this national campaign.
Veronica?
There is absolutely no doubt that the incumbent president wields an enormous amount of power. He's extremely popular to this day. And the fact that Sara Duterte won and that the Bongbong Marcos campaign won are to a large extent due to the way that Duterte runs the government machinery and to the popularity that he has. I mean, so it's much more subtle than whether or not he spoke or whether Mr. Andanar and his colleagues were speaking specifically supporting these candidates.
Jim,
what we have here is I think you could call it a liberal democracy producing an illiberal outcome.
Jim?
What struck me is how little issues played any real role in this election. It, as often is the case, it was about personalities. I wonder if Duterte, Sara was not on the ticket, would Marcos have won? I think it was a combination, a remarkable combination of name recognition. And I also wonder, and we have had, at least I have seen at this distance, mind you, I'm in Washington, not in the Philippines, but I have not seen very many in-depth interviews with the incoming President Marcos on issue-orientated
he refused to do them.
questions.
He refused to do them. He was invited to many presidential debates to take part, and he refused to do all of them.
I think, sorry, it does appear that he spent a great deal of effort and time on sort of whitewashing the past and making sure that people believed it was a golden era. I want to talk to you, Jim, and then Veronica, because you both have stories that can illuminate what really happened in that period. Jim, I'd like to start with you. So, as we mentioned, you were covering the Philippines, specifically the political part. When you returned on that plane with a very prominent opposition leader, Senator Aquino, in 1983, and he was assassinated just hours after you interviewed him. Can you tell us about what happened?
Well, Senator Aquino was returning to the Philippines to try to involve himself again in politics after having been first in jail and then in exile with the help of the Americans in Boston. So he was flying in from Taipei, Taiwan. I was with him. I did the last interview with him. It was perceived at the time that he could have been a very popular politician and possibly president at some point. We arrived at Manila Airport, and a number of security people boarded the plane and escorted him off the plane. It was actually only minutes after my interview with him, in which he said, if my fate is assassination, so be it, he said. Within minutes of him leaving the aircraft, he was escorted down onto the tarmac. We heard bullets ring out. I pushed my way to the window to see what I could see, and I saw him flat down on the tarmac with blood spurting out of the back of his head. He had been wearing a bulletproof vest, he told me. It didn't seem to do any good if you're going to shoot somebody in the back of the head. This was the beginning of the end of the Marcos regime. Now, Marcos himself was never implicated directly in the assassination, but his leading military commander, General Ver, was. And we still, in my view, despite at least two investigations, don't know the entire story of that assassination. But
Jim,
it was clear from that point that Marcos's days were numbered.
Jim, I just want to take a moment to have a very quick listen to your report from that time.
I looked out the window, and what I first saw was the body of Aquino on the runway, only a few feet from the exit. His face was down on the runway, an extremely serious wound in the back of the head. He was bleeding profusely. It appeared there was no way that he could live.
Jim, as you said, that was a turning point for Marcos's rule. And of course, about 3 years later, There was the storming of the Marcos presidential palace and the revolution. You were one of the few journalists at the palace at the time, and you went in. What did you find?
Well, initially, of course, there was tremendous chaos around the palace. There were contending sides. Both Marcos supporters and Aquino supporters were there. Mrs. Aquino, by this time, had adopted the mantle, if you will, of the opposition, wearing her famous yellow dress and all of that. And there was a snap election, which she was pitted against Marcos. But what really happened here is after 5 presidents, from President Johnson up to President Reagan, the Americans finally pulled the plug on Ferdinand Marcos, and they flew him out of Clark Air Base, first to Guam and then on to Hawaii, where he died a few years later. The chaos around Malacanang Palace was enormous. People, battered their way into the palace, rifling through the desks of the offices, and of course, the personal quarters of both Marcos and Imelda, his wife. The famous, shoe story came out of that as they discovered, her great shoe collection and her collection of very expensive designer dresses with the labels still in place.
Jim, everything you describe, and we're running out of time. I want to get to Veronica for one final answer, but everything you describe is of a life spent in tremendous opulence while the rest of the country struggled a great deal. So the idea that this was a golden period, I think you've dispelled that. Veronica, your chance to do the same. Your family left in 1971 after your mother published an unauthorized biography of Imelda Marcos. There were threats around your family. You saw the writing was on the wall. The martial law period was coming up imminently. And then, interestingly, you went back to the Philippines to confront Imelda Marcos in your documentary, Imelda and Me. And you found a woman who was either unrepentant or delusional.
Both, probably. The myth of the golden era is one that, for some reason, has pervaded the imagination of a Philippines that wants to look to a future. We've been talking about the past here, about what happened in 1986. It's been decades since then, and the people who live here now want to see change. And I think that the new president-elect is going to face a very uphill journey to keep the alliance together that he has with the Duterte family, and to actually bring into reality the hopes of the people. There are almost a quarter of the people in this country live in poverty. Their expectations may, in fact, be the undoing of an election that was run on the basis of getting votes, not on the basis of doing well for the people of the Philippines. And that is the fault of Philippine politics.
So Bongbong is saying, judge me not by my ancestors, but by my actions. Are you prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt?
I wasn't in the Philippines in 1986 during People Power, although I was active in the anti-Marcos campaign from overseas. I was at university getting a degree, unlike Bongbong Marcos.
Martin, come in.
Yes, I was saying I would like to have a rejoinder to what Veronica said earlier in our conversation. The problem was after '86, the promises were not delivered by the Cory Aquino administration and later on by the Noynoy Aquino administration. And when the Duterte administration came, giving a massive infrastructure building program called the Build, Build, Build. That's why we call this era as the golden age of infrastructure, working hard to lower the crime volume and lower the poverty incidence from 24 to 14% pre-pandemic. And so many projects of the Duterte administration were, I guess, seen by the followers of President-elect Bongbong Marcos as programs that President-elect Bongbong Marcos can continue.
Veronica?
That may be the case. That may be the case, but there is a flip side, and as Mr. Andanar very well knows, a darker side to the Duterte regime, the Duterte administration, in the form of the extrajudicial killings that have riven the country. There is no doubt that he is extremely popular in the country, because of the drop in crime rate. I think that's undeniable. I talk to people, in poor areas, and they are very grateful for that. But it's brought enormous damage to the rule of law, to due process. I really think that people in the Philippines are living in an environment of total impunity.
Veronica Pedrosa, Martin Andanar, and Jim Laurie, I'm so sorry we have run out of time. The director has called time on this discussion. It has gone past very, very quickly, but to all of you, my deepest thanks and appreciation. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.